Okay, so let's see the practical application we are going to develop now.
So if I run this now, if I put admin, I know admin, I have programmed it now. So if I put admin, right? Awesome guys, awesome. So it's going to the admin page, so close. If I put a normal user, say ABC, right? And if I say the normal user, if I give a wrong password, wonderful, invalid username password. If I put the right password for a normal user, awesome guys, normal user
Okay, so let's continue to develop this application now.
channel. So what I do is I store the reference in the parent interface type, right? Why? You have to look at our video on interface if you want to know why it is. So obj user control implementation, right? User control implementation. So now on this I can call the method, right? What's the method? So I want to tell my controller to help me validate the user login. Then I have to pass the username and the password. So I'm in the form, right? So the form can access the two text boxes, right? What are the names? This should be text box 1 and text box 2, right? So what I'm going to do is I know the default names are text box 1 and text box 2. So text box 1 dot text, right? And then text box 2 dot text, right? Okay guys, right? Text box 1 and 2, right? So right, and so it's now it will call the validate user login method, right? So then I had to look at it. So what I had to do from the validate login in the control is I'll have to connect to the model. So in the model I have to connect to the business logic, which is user logic, right? So the user logic is in the model and the namespace is model. So what I had to do is in the control I had to first import the namespace, right? So I had to say using model, right? And now I can from the controller I can create objects of whatever in the model. So which is I want to access the logic class, which is user logic implementation. So now in the controller I can create object of user logic implementation, right? But once again, give me a sec. And once again, the user logic implementation is inheriting from parent interface. So best practice in coding is you will store the return object of user logic in not in the class type, instead of that interface type, right? That's the best practice. So then on the controller, right? The controller now can call the logic and get the help of the logic to validate the user login, right? That's how you this is how you go through layers, multi layers separation of concerns. Then what you do is you pass the username and the password, right? You are passing username and the password. So now the controller has called the logic. Now what the logic class should do is, if you go to the logic class, this is the logic class, what it should do is now it has to perform the logic, right? What is the logic? It has to validate the username and the password. But for that it has to get the help of the DAO because it needs data. And the DAO is connected to the database and you have got a SQL query to validate, right? So what you have to do now is you have to create an object of the DAO. Now the DAO is in the same project model. So what is the name? User DAO, right? Yeah, user DAO. So user DAO implementation obj, right? So you create an object of user DAO because you need the help of the DAO class now to access the database. And once again, the DAO got a parent interface, right? I have not implemented it. I have to implement it, right? So that's the best code in practice, guys. That's the best code in practice. So make sure you implement it, right? Now, and in the DAO, user DAO, I have to make sure that you know that this I use a DAO that you have to have, otherwise it's not matching, right? So I got the DAO, right? So the DAO has the parent interface. I use a DAO. So you have to make sure that in your logic, when you create the DAO object, you have to make sure that you store it in a interface. I use a DAO. Now on the DAO, you got. Let's look at the DAO, right? If you look at the DAO, you have the method get user by username and password. So I have to call that method, right? That's the theory. So my friends, I have to call get user by username and password, right? So this is how things are getting connected, right? This is how things are getting connected. So get user by username and password, right? And then I have to pass the, if you look at the DAO, you have to pass the username and the password, right? Awesome friends, we are progressing really well, right? So username and the password, right? Cool. So you got the username and the password being passed. Mm, it looks fine, right? It looks fine. So now look at what's happening in the DAO. So inside the DAO, so when the business logic call the DAO will call that method. So what is this method? Just to remind you, that is what you created here, right? Get user by username and password. So the DAO is calling that method. That's why it's returning a table. Now what you have to do is, now you have to understand when you call this method, that remember you wrote SQL, you can move your mouse and see the SQL. So what happens is when you call this method, this SQL will get executed, and the username, if you see the username and the password, right, this is what you are passing here to that method. You are passing the username and the, so it will execute the query, right? And as you saw, it either returns raw or returns null, right? You saw it earlier. So but whatever comes here, so now you have to check this table to figure out whether you got any data or not, right? So how do you check that is, you got a method called count to count and see how many data items were returned. So it returns an integer, right? So it's a property, so it returns an integer. So you can store that and say okay, data count, right? Say data. So then if this data count is 0, right, this is the interesting thing, guys. If this data count is 0, that means you have not received any data. That means you have received null. Meaning, when do you receive null? Meaning when the username or the password is wrong. So now you know, if you receive the data count as 0, that you understand it's either username or password is wrong. Else, right, I'm just saying, else you will know that you it's valid username and the password. So now you have to tackle that. So if it's 0, what do you want to do, right? Now one important thing, uh, now the return type is what matters. So if I want, I can say boolean, right? Bool, and then return false here. I'm just giving example, right? And then return true here. So whoever calls this method, now whoever calls this method, who will call this method? This method will be invoked, the DAO will be invoked by the logic. So when the logic call this, the logic will receive either true or false, right? So that is one option. But if the logic returns false, the logic will know that it's invalid username. If the logic receives a true, it knows it's a valid username and a password. That is one option. The other option is, because this is a DAO, I can say, for example, if I want, when I use a logins, if I want to know his user level, because you remember in the user table there's a user level. So if I want to capture the user level, then what I can do is, instead of returning true or false, if I also need to know the user level, what I can do is I can return a user object here with the user level as well. So what do I mean is something like this. Now for me to do that, that is where you got this concept of entity, the entity class, where the object relational mapping. Meaning for the user table, I can have inside the model I can have an entity class, right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a class called user, right? User. So in the user is going to be like just an entity class which will just have let me say that I want to make it public, and the user class will just represent the entity, like okay, UID, username, password, user level, right? So this is the data, UID, username, password, sorry, user level, right? So I will say int, because it's a if you look at the data types of this, you will see these are integer, right? So you can right click and you can have a look at it. When you say open table definition, you can have a look at it, right? So these are integers. So int, let us say UID, right? Let's say something like that, int UID, and then what are the data, right? So username, password, user table. So let me say this is simple UID. This just not a problem, but I'm following some naming convention. So username, password, and user level, right? So username, but username is a string username, then string password and int user level, right? So username, password, and the user level. Okay, my friends, username, password, and the user level, right? Wonderful, guys. Wonderful, wonderful. So then I will need the getters and setters, my friends. So I'm going to right click on this and say quick actions. Look at our previous videos on class and objects if you want to know more about this. Then I can click on this and generate the getters and setters. So I got a user class with the user ID name. So what I'm going to do now is on the DAO, right? Rather than returning true or false, I'm going to return I'm going to return a user object, right? Which I'm going to fill the data with whatever the data I receive. If it's successful login, I can get the data from this object and put it to the user, right? User object, right? So in the DAO implementation, this user DAO, right? You will say it's not void. You are going to return a user. Okay, my friends. So what I'm going to do now is, so for me to do that, I'm going to create a user object at the top, right? But say obj user, but I'm going to keep it null, right? So initially it's null because if the data is 0, I have no data, so I can return the null. So the calling method means the DAO will be called by the logic. So if the logic class calling this receives a null user object, then the logic class knows either the username or the password is incorrect. That's why you will receive a null object, right? But if not, if it's not null, the logic class will know that it's a successful username and a password. So let's look what I'm doing, then you will understand further, right? So if during this lecture, if there's something confusing you, just uh, look at this patiently. You will understand this, when you complete this, right? Maybe not at once. You might have to look at this video again one more time and look at our previous videos as well. So what I'm going to do is, it's null, so I can just just say, right, return the object user without anything because it's just null, right? Or I can say return null. I'm just telling you, right? Just say return null so that it's return null, so the user will be null, right? I'm just giving example, right? uh, Now if not, okay, now then what I can do is I can just bring this down, right? So because I need it only if I have something. So what I can do here is, now I can create a user object, right? Because when I'm in else, I know that it it's not 0, so that means there is one data item here, meaning successful username and password. Now for what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put this and finally return the user object. But before I return the user object, I'll have to fill it with the data which is inside this. So now the question is, how can I access the data, right? Hope what I'm telling is clear to you, right? Because you need to access the data, right? You need to access the data from this object user data table. So how do you access the data, right? Now for that you have to understand what this is, right? And you have to get the data and put it to the obj user before you return it. Now this is defined in the MSDN. So this obj user data table is going to be a child of the user, the data table in the ADO.NET, right? Data set. So if you look at this, let me open a reference. Give me a sec. So I'm going to open one of the references, right? Okay, so I open some MSDN references, right? So the official guide.